My name is Evelyn Harper, and the question that day asked on the church porch in front of God, and everyone hit me so hard I almost dropped the cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands. Miss Evelyn, the young mother, said, her voice breaking just enough to make people nearby stop pretending not to listen. Why do we only call when we need money, and not when we need you? For a second, the world went quiet. The hymns from inside the church faded. The birds stopped chirping. And all I could hear was the echo of a lifetime spent answering phones that rang only when someone wanted something. I smiled. Not because it was funny. Not because it didn't hurt. I smiled because I had already lived the answer, and it had cost me more than she could imagine. I invited her to sit beside me on the old wooden bench that had been there longer than most of us. The porch boards creaked the same way they always did, like they were reminding me that some things endure even when people don't. You're not asking the wrong question, I told her. But the answer isn't short, and it isn't gentle. That's when I began to tell her my story. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where people waved from their porches and meant it. I married young, raised 3 children, and built a life that looked ordinary from the outside. My husband worked at the mill until it shut down. I cleaned houses, packed lunches, stretched one paycheck into 2. We didn't have much, but we had a table everyone came home to, at least back then. When the kids were little, they needed me for everything. Scraped knees, homework, bad dreams. I was their first call, their last comfort. I thought that meant something permanent. I thought love, once planted, stayed rooted. I was wrong. As the years passed, the calls changed. First, they came less often. Then they came with pauses, awkward silences before the real reason came out. Mom, I hate to ask, but rent was due. The car broke down. The credit card was maxed out. There was always a reason, always an emergency. I helped every time, because that's what mothers do. Or at least, that's what I believed. What no one tells you is how quiet the phone gets when you stop being useful. Birthdays came and went with cards mailed late. Holidays were busy this year, Mom. I'd sit by the window on Thanksgiving morning, watching other families drive past, and tell myself next year would be different. It rarely was. Still, I didn't complain. I didn't confront. I didn't raise my voice. I learned early that if you want to keep the peace, you swallow a lot of truth. Then came the year that changed everything. It was the winter my husband passed. A heart attack in our kitchen right between the sink and the stove, where I'd stood for decades. The house filled with casseroles and sympathy for a week. After that, the silence returned heavier than before. The phone rang 3 days after the funeral. Mom, my son said, clearing his throat. I hate to bring this up now, but do you know if Dad had any savings? I remember gripping the counter, staring at the dent his body had made when he fell. That was the moment I understood something painful and permanent. I wasn't being called because I was lonely. I wasn't being called because I was grieving. I was being called because I was a resource. That realization didn't turn me bitter overnight. It turned me quiet. I stopped offering help before it was asked for. I stopped filling in the gaps they left. I learned to sit with my loneliness instead of paying to avoid it. I started volunteering at the church, not to stay busy, but to remember who I was before I became everyone's safety net. People mistook my silence for weakness. Even my children did. What they didn't know was that silence can be a decision. Years passed. I watched my children build lives that didn't include me unless there was a problem. I prayed for them anyway. I loved them anyway. But I stopped bleeding for them. That's why when that mother asked me on the church porch why children only call when they need money, I didn't answer right away. Because the truth isn't just about children. It's about what we teach them. It's about what we tolerate. It's about the quiet agreements we make with ourselves to stay needed, even when it costs us dignity. I looked at her tired eyes and saw myself years ago still hoping love could be bought with sacrifice. So I said, gently placing my hand over hers, "Let me tell you what happened the day my phone rang." And I didn't rush to answer. That was the beginning of the story that changed everything. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray day where the sky feels low and heavy, like it's pressing down on your shoulders. I was standing in the kitchen peeling apples for a pie. I didn't really need to bake, just something to keep my hands busy. I let the phone ring longer than usual. Not out of spite, not to make a point. I just wanted to feel what it was like to choose my own pace for once. When I finally picked up, my daughter's voice rushed out in a breathless tumble. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the weather or church or the way Dad's chair still sat empty at the table. "Mom, I'm in a bind," she said. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't have to." Those words had become a familiar opening line, polished smooth by repetition. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. "What kind of bind?" I asked. She explained it all quickly: late fees, a short paycheck, a promise she'd made to someone else before checking her bank balance. I listened carefully, the way I always had, filling in the details she skipped, because she assumed I already understood. And I did. I understood too well. What she didn't know was that her call came exactly 3 weeks after my birthday. A birthday she'd missed. No call, no card, no message. Just another quiet day that I spent convincing myself it didn't matter. I told her I needed to check something and asked her to hold. I set the phone down on the table and stared at it like it might start talking back. That was the moment I realized something else, something even harder to admit than being forgotten. I had trained them to call me this way. For years I had answered every request without hesitation. I had fixed problems before they became lessons. I had smoothed over consequences with checks and apologies and quiet sacrifices. In my fear of being left out, I had made myself useful instead of present. When I picked the phone back up, my voice was calm. Too calm, she later said. "I can't help this time," I told her. There was a pause, not silent shock. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Mom, it's not that much." "I know," I said, "but I still can't." She tried again, changing tactics. Guilt, logic, familiar affection. When that didn't work, frustration crept in. "You've never said no before," she snapped. I almost laughed at that. Almost. "I know," I said quietly. "That's part of the problem." She hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there for a long time after that, the apple peels browning on the counter, the pie forgotten. I expected to feel relieved, strong, victorious even. Instead, I felt hollow. That's the thing. No one tells you about drawing boundaries late in life. It hurts more than letting things slide. Not because you're wrong, but because you've waited too long. Over the next few months, the pattern repeated itself. A call from my son about his car. Another from my youngest about a temporary loan that never seemed to end. Each time I listened. Each time I asked questions I'd never asked before. "Have you looked at other options? What happens if I say no? What are you really asking me for?" The answers weren't always honest. Sometimes they were angry. Sometimes they were cold. The calls became fewer. People might think that's when I felt most alone, but they'd be wrong. The loneliest part had already passed, the years when I answered every call and still felt invisible. I started noticing things again. The sound of the clock in the hallway. The way the light hit the floor in the afternoon. The peace of sitting in church without worrying about who might need me afterward. I began to understand that being needed and being loved are not the same thing. One Sunday after service, I overheard 2 women talking behind me. They didn't know I was listening. "Evelyn's children don't come around much," one of them said. She must have done something, the other replied. I didn't turn around. I didn't correct them. Letting people misunderstand you is a quiet kind of strength. Because the truth was, I was finally doing something for myself. I didn't stop loving my children. That kind of love doesn't switch off. But I stopped confusing love with rescue. I stopped answering every ring like it was an alarm. And in that space between the calls and the silence, I found something unexpected. Clarity. That's what I was trying to explain to the mother on the church porch as she listened to me, her hands folded tight in her lap. She nodded slowly, like each word was landing somewhere tender. I thought if I kept helping, she whispered, they'd stay close. So did I told her. I didn't tell her yet about the call that came later, the one that tested every boundary I'd built, the one that proved silence can be louder than shouting. That part of the story was still ahead. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to change everything. There was no speech, no announcement, no dramatic moment where I finally stood up for myself. What happened was quieter than that. It happened in the spaces between calls. After I said no that first time, the house felt different. Not emptier, just honest. I noticed how much of my day had been organized around other people's emergencies. Without them, time stretched out in unfamiliar ways. I didn't know what to do with myself at first. I wandered from room to room like a guest in my own life. That's when I realized how long it had been since I'd asked myself a simple question. What do I need? For years, my answer would have been easy. I needed my children to need me. I needed to feel useful. I needed proof that I still mattered. But usefulness is a fragile kind of worth. It disappears the moment someone finds another solution. So I stopped filling the silence. When the phone rang, I didn't jump. When it didn't ring, I didn't panic. I let the quiet sit with me even when it felt uncomfortable. Especially then. People assume silence means weakness. They're wrong. Silence, when chosen, is preparation. I began putting my affairs in order. Not because I was planning to leave this world anytime soon, but because I wanted control over what I'd built. I went through old files, bank statements, handwritten notes I'd tucked away for years. I learned things about my own finances I'd never bothered to understand, because someone else always needed me more. I met with a financial advisor at the credit union downtown. He spoke slowly, kindly, like he understood I wasn't just organizing money, I was reclaiming something I'd given away piece by piece. I also started giving my time differently. I volunteered at the church food pantry twice a week. I listened to stories that weren't mine. I helped without being expected to fix anyone's life. There's a difference between generosity and obligation. I was finally learning it. My children noticed the change, but not in the way I'd hoped. You've been distant, my son said once during one of the rare visits that didn't involve a request. I've been quiet, I corrected. He frowned, uncomfortable with the distinction. They weren't used to not knowing what I was thinking. For years, I'd worn my heart where everyone could reach it. Now I kept some things to myself. That unsettled them. The calls became shorter, less frequent, more cautious. And then came the test. It was late evening when my phone lit up with my son's name. I knew before I answered that this call would be different. The tone of his voice confirmed it. Mom, he said, and for the first time in a long while, there was no rush in his words. I need to talk to you. Not I need help, not I need money, just talk. I sat down. He told me about a mistake he'd made at work. A big one. One that couldn't be fixed with a check or a quick solution. He was scared. Not of consequences, but of being seen clearly for the first time. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause. I could almost hear him bracing himself for advice, for rescue, for me to step in and smooth things over like I always had. I didn't. What are you going to do? I asked. He hesitated. I don't know. That's honest, I said, and it's a place to start. He waited for more. I didn't give it. That was when something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. For the first time, my silence forced him to think instead of lean. My restraint gave him room to grow instead of fall back on me. It wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it, with anger or punishment. It was something quieter. It was dignity. I didn't tell him what to do. I didn't take control. I trusted him to face his own life. And when the call ended, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Respect. Not from him yet, from myself. That night I slept deeply. No racing thoughts, no second guessing. Just rest. The next morning, I woke up knowing something important. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I would never again be the woman who solved everyone's problems at the cost of her own peace. That's what I meant when I told the mother on the church porch that silence isn't surrender. It's a decision. She looked at me with wide eyes like she was afraid of what that decision might cost her. It sounds lonely, she said. It was, I admitted, until it wasn't. Because something happens when you stop overgiving. The people who only wanted what you could provide fall away. The ones who want you really want, you have to step forward or be left behind. Not everyone does. And that's painful. But it's also honest. I didn't tell her yet what happened next. I didn't tell her about the call that came months later, the one that arrived not with desperation, but with humility. The one that proved boundaries don't destroy families, they reveal them. That part of the story still needed time. The call came late after 10, when most people only reach out if something has gone wrong. I was already in bed, the lamp on my nightstand casting a soft circle of light over a book I wasn't really reading. My phone buzzed once then again. My son's name filled the screen. I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted to punish him. I just needed a moment to remind myself that urgency on someone else's end did not require panic on mine. When I did pick up, his voice was tight controlled in the way people get when they're trying not to fall apart. Mom, he said, I messed up, bad. I waited. He explained that he'd lost his job. Not laid off, fired. A decision he'd made a corner, he'd cut a rule he'd ignored, because he thought no one would notice. Someone did. Now the paycheck he depended on was gone, and with it, the fragile balance he'd been juggling for years. I don't know what to do, he said. I can't make rent this month. There it was. The familiar turn. The place where for most of my life, I would have stepped in without hesitation. I took a breath. I'm sorry you're going through this, I said, and I meant it. Then I stopped talking. He waited, the silence stretching between us. I could almost hear him preparing his next sentence, the one where he asked outright. Mom, he said finally. Yes. Are you going to help me? I stared at the ceiling, at the faint crack that ran along the plaster like a thin scar. I thought about the birthdays I'd spent alone. The holidays where my chair sat empty at someone else's table. The calls that only came when the numbers didn't add up. And I thought about the man on the other end of the line, a grown man, not a child who had learned without ever meaning to, that consequences were optional if his mother was willing to carry them. I'm not, I said gently. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. Anger flared fast just beneath the surface. You're really going to do this now, he snapped. After everything I'm dealing with. I am, I said, and I should have done it sooner. He accused me of being cold, of changing, of turning my back on him when he needed me most. Each word landed where he intended it to, on old guilt, old habits, old fears. But something was different this time. I'm not turning my back, I said. I'm stepping out of the way. He went quiet. I can help you think through your options, I continued. I can listen. I can be here. But I can't fix this for you. That's when he said something I didn't expect. You're not the same, he said. Not angrily this time. Confused, almost wounded. I know, I replied. Neither are you. The call ended without resolution. No shouting, no forgiveness, just distance. I sat there afterward, phone resting in my palm, heart pounding like I'd just run a mile. My hands shook. I won't pretend they didn't. Standing your ground at my age doesn't come naturally when you've spent a lifetime bending. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Doubt crept in, whispering that I'd gone too far, that I'd crossed the thin line between boundaries and abandonment. But by morning, something else took its place. Peace. Not comfort, not relief, peace. Days passed. Then weeks. I didn't hear from him. I didn't reach out either. This wasn't a standoff. It was space, real space, where choices had room to breathe. Then one afternoon, the phone rang again. It was him. I figured something out, he said. His voice sounded older somehow, steadier. I found temporary work. It's not great, but it's mine. I'm selling the truck, downsizing. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. That sounds responsible, I said. There was another pause, but this one felt different. I was mad at you, he admitted. But I get it now. You didn't leave me. You just stopped carrying me. Tears pricked my eyes, surprising me with their suddenness. That's all I ever wanted, I said softly. He didn't ask for money. He didn't apologize outright. He didn't need to. Something had shifted between us, something fragile, but real. When I finished telling this part of the story on the church porch, the mother beside me sat very still. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. That sounds so hard, she said. What if they never come back? I looked at her and told her the truth. Some don't, I said, and that hurts. But the ones who do, they come back differently. She swallowed, stronger. Yes, I said, and so do you. Because the hardest lesson I learned wasn't how to say no. It was how to accept that love, real love, doesn't grow when one person does all the giving. It grows when everyone is allowed to stand on their own feet, even if they stumble first. What my son faced that year changed him. What I faced changed me. And neither of us would have grown if I'd written another check and called it love. I didn't hear from my daughter for months after that. No calls, no texts, no half-hearted updates passed through someone else. Just silence. People assume silence always means anger. Sometimes it means embarrassment. Sometimes it means thinking. And sometimes it means someone is finally seeing a situation without the cushion you used to provide. When she did call, it wasn't with urgency. It wasn't late at night or rushed between errands. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the house settles into itself. Mom, she said, careful, do you have time to talk? I do, I answered. She didn't start with money. She didn't start with excuses. She started with something that caught me off guard. I didn't realize how much I leaned on you, she said. Not just for help, for relief. I waited. She told me about the months since our last conversation. How she'd had to make decisions she'd always avoided. How uncomfortable it was to sit with problems instead of handing them off. How she'd been angry at me at first, not because I'd refused her, but because I'd forced her to see herself. I thought you were pulling away, she said. But really, you were letting go. That word, letting go, hung between us. I never wanted to let go of you, I said. Just the part of our relationship that hurt us both. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for, the one I knew would come eventually. Did we really hurt you that much? I closed my eyes. There are questions you answer carefully because honesty can bruise if you swing it too hard. Yes, I said. But not because you needed help. Because needing me was the only time you remembered I existed. She didn't cry. I think she wanted to. Instead, she listened. Really listened. I told her about the empty holidays, the birthdays spent alone, the way I'd learned to check my phone only to confirm what I already knew. I didn't stop loving you, I said. I stopped disappearing. That was when she apologized. Not with big words or dramatic regret. Just a simple acknowledgement that landed heavier than anything else. I didn't know she said, but I should have. We didn't fix everything that day. Reconciliation doesn't work like that. It's not a moment, it's a practice. But from then on, things changed. She started calling just to talk. Short calls at first, awkward ones. Sometimes she didn't know what to say without a problem to solve. We learned each other again slowly, like people meeting for the first time. My son changed too in his own way. He became more careful with his choices, more thoughtful. Not because I demanded it, but because I no longer shielded him from consequences. One afternoon, months later, all three of my children came by together. No warning, no reason, just coffee and conversation. I watched them sit at my table, the same table they'd once gathered around as kids, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Seen. Not needed, seen. When I finished this part of the story on the church porch, the mother beside me let out a slow breath she'd been holding since the beginning. So you stopped helping? She said. And that's what brought them back. I shook my head. No, I said. I stopped rescuing. I never stopped loving. There's a difference most of us don't learn until it hurts. Helping says, I'll take this from you. Loving says, I trust you to carry it yourself. That distinction changes families. I told her not to expect miracles, not to expect gratitude right away, and not to confuse guilt with growth. Children don't mature because we suffer for them. They mature when we allow them to face themselves. She nodded, eyes glassy like someone standing on the edge of a hard decision. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she whispered. I reached for her hand. You already are, I said. You're just afraid of losing what you've been using to feel close. She swallowed. As she stood to leave, she turned back to me. Do you ever regret it? She asked. The silence? The no? I thought about it. No, I said. I regret how long it took me to choose myself. That's the truth I carry now. Not bitterness, not pride, just clarity. Love doesn't demand you erase yourself. It asks you to show up whole. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for them and for yourself is to stop answering the phone the old way. Forgiveness came quietly. Not all at once, and not wrapped in apologies the way people expect. It arrived in small, ordinary moments, the kind you almost miss if you're still waiting for something dramatic. After the conversations with my children, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We were not going back to how things were, but we weren't walking away either. That space between those two truths was uncomfortable at first. My daughter started calling every Sunday afternoon. At the beginning, the calls were short and careful, like she was testing unfamiliar ground. She'd talk about work, the weather, something she'd cooked. There were pauses where neither of us knew what to say. I let those pauses stay. I didn't rush to fill them with advice or offers. Over time, the calls grew easier. One day she said, I used to think love meant fixing everything. I smiled to myself and replied, so did I. My son's changes showed up differently. He became more deliberate, more present. When he visited, he helped without being asked. Not because he owed me, but because he saw me. We talked more honestly than we ever had before. Not just about his problems, but about his fears, his regrets. Things he'd never admitted when he thought I was there to rescue him. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt. For years, I'd carried a quiet resentment I didn't want to admit existed. I told myself it was just fatigue, or age, or grief. But resentment has a way of sneaking in when love is one-sided. Once I stopped overgiving, that bitterness had nothing to feed on. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about refusing to let it define every moment that comes after. I didn't forget the empty holidays. I didn't forget the calls that only came with requests. But I also didn't cling to them. I chose something steadier. One afternoon, my daughter asked me a question that told me more than any apology could have. "Mom," she said, "if I mess up again, will you still answer the phone?" I thought carefully before answering. "Yes," I said, "but I won't save you from it." She laughed softly. "That sounds fair." And it was. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to old patterns. It means building new ones that don't require someone to disappear in order for everyone else to stay comfortable. That's what I tried to explain to the mother on the church porch as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched across the wooden boards. She listened closely, as if she were memorizing every word. "So you forgive them," she said slowly, "but you don't forget yourself." "That's right," I replied. "I forgave them so I could breathe again. And I remembered myself so I wouldn't disappear." She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. "I've been afraid that if I stop helping, they'll stop loving me." "That fear makes sense," I said. But love that only survives on sacrifice isn't love. It's dependence. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks without any effort to stop them. I didn't rush to comfort her. Sometimes people need a moment to sit with the truth before they can stand up again. Before she left, she asked one last question. "Do you ever worry they'll forget what you did for them?" I smiled, a real one this time. "They might," I said, "but that's not my burden anymore." That was the final lesson forgiveness taught me. You don't forgive so others will remember your kindness. You forgive so you don't have to keep proving it. As the church bells rang inside, calling people back to their routines, I watched the mother walk away a little straighter than when she'd arrived. Not fixed, not certain, but aware. Aware that love doesn't require erasing yourself. Aware that boundaries don't kill families, they give them a chance to grow up. I stayed on the porch a while longer, thinking about how far I'd come. About the woman I used to be, who thought being needed was the same as being loved. About the woman I am now, who understands the difference. Forgiveness without forgetting gave me that clarity. And clarity at this stage of life is a gift. I stayed on the church porch after the mother left, listening to the low murmur of voices drifting out from inside. People were gathering their coats, planning lunches, moving on with their day. Life, as always, didn't pause just because someone had finally understood something important. I thought about how many years it had taken me to learn what I'd just passed on in one afternoon. The truth is, I never wanted revenge. Not the kind people imagine anyway. I didn't want my children to suffer. I didn't want them to feel abandoned or ashamed. What I wanted, what I needed, was to stop being invisible in my own life. That's the part no one talks about when they say, "But they're your children." Yes, they are. And I am their mother. Not their bank. Not their safety net forever. Not the place they land only when everything else collapses. When I stopped rescuing, I didn't punish them. I educated them. And I educated myself too. Over time, my family found a new balance. Not perfect, not storybook, but honest. There are still weeks when no one calls. And that's okay now. When the phone rings, it's often just to talk. Sometimes it's about something hard. Sometimes it's about nothing at all. Both feel like gifts. I no longer sit by the window waiting. I live my days fully. I volunteer. I read. I walk. I pray. I rest without guilt. I've learned that peace is not something you earn by suffering quietly. It's something you claim by telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. If you're listening to my story and you recognize yourself in it, if you've ever wondered why love in your family feels conditional, or why you're only remembered when you're needed, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to matter without paying for it. You are allowed to be loved without proving your usefulness. And you are allowed to say no, even late in life. Boundaries are not rejection. They are instruction. They teach people how to treat you. And they teach you how to treat yourself. If my story made you pause or brought up something you've been carrying quietly, take a moment today to reflect. Share it with someone who might need it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about family dignity and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself, consider staying with us. Sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't shouted. They're told softly on a church porch by someone who finally learned to listen to herself.